What a lot of people don't recognize about the brain is that it's actually a prediction machine. When you are visualizing, what is stimulating the visual cortex in the brain is also becoming a blueprint in your brain. It becomes instructions to the brain's navigator to take you to your goal. Belief itself is a way to invite luck. When you change your neurochemistry, you are preparing your brain for luck. I don't think you want to be a person who closes doors prematurely.
Welcome to Lottery Dreams and Fortune. I am very excited to be joined here today with Srini Pillay. This is going to be an extremely fascinating conversation. He is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, a brain researcher, and a best-selling author. He's the author of The Science Behind the Law of Attraction, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, and he has a number of books and projects, but it's so fascinating. Srini, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Tim. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. I'm excited for you to be here. Many viewers that are watching or listening to this today have dreamt about lottery numbers, or they have written them down on a vision board, or written down that they want to win, and then it's happened. From your perspective as a brain researcher, could there be more to this than just merely coincidence, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think right now most people would question whether there's a science behind the law of attraction, mostly because most people who have vision boards or put checks in their drawers or play the lottery don't win. However, I would not agree with that. I believe that the anecdote, the rare person who does win the lottery, or the rare person who does have a vision board and then have a house manifest, has most likely tapped into something in their brains that has allowed them to optimize their brain to prepare the brain for this law of attraction. I think partly some of my own experiences have actually led me to believe in this law. So, do I think it's a fact? I think there's a lot of brain research to suggest that you can prepare your brain to optimize for the law of attraction. And based on that, I have the belief and hypothesis that it does in fact exist.
Well, that is so fascinating. When you do visualize a goal, no matter what it is, if it's a new job, a relationship, the lottery, anything, if you're visualizing something and then it does happen, or maybe a sporting event, a lot of athletes do this, what actually is happening in the brain? How does the brain store and act on that intention? You feel something and then you visualize it and then it happens. What actually is happening inside of the brain?
I wrote a paper on this once called Making a Mental Movie in Your Head. And really, what is happening is that you're making a blueprint in your brain and you're adding that to the brain's prediction machinery. So, what a lot of people don't recognize about the brain is that it's actually a prediction machine. So, it's constantly trying to predict where to go next. And so, the more information you feed it, the more likely it is to use that information to guide you in the right direction, whether it is to think about numbers or to find the house of your dreams. And so when you are visualizing, what is stimulating the visual cortex in the brain is also becoming a blueprint in your brain. It becomes instructions to the brain's navigator to take you to your goal. We see this a lot, in sport, for example, where in sport they use visualization pretty tangibly to improve specific skills. Like in tennis, there's a type of imagery called cognitive specific imagery, where you can practice the serve over and over again in your mind, and that translates into an improvement in how you actually serve. Or we also see imagery in other sports where you imagine coming from behind. And in fact, when you do that very vividly, you are able to get to your goal. So there is some preliminary evidence to show that imagining is a way of creating a blueprint in your brain that allows you to get to your goal because you're feeding the brain's prediction machine. So most people assume that the brain is just sitting there determining reality. But actually what the brain is doing is editing what you will see based on your prediction. So if you say, ah, there's no such thing as this law of attraction, I'm not going to draw a vision board, the brain's like, oh, okay, then let's make sure that if if you don't want to draw that, that's not going to be. I'm not going to predict that that's going to happen, and I'm not going to drive that outcome. Whereas if you remain open to it, it is amazing the kinds of things that can happen. A brief story about me. I'm originally from South Africa, and I was standing in a game reserve after going to an amazing talk, and I was standing next to this professor just after medical school, and I don't know what made me say this, but this is an example of what it is. I just looked at him and I said, your talk was amazing, and I just have a feeling you could change my life. And he looked at me and said, well, he laughed and he said, I don't really know you. What do you like? And I said, well, I'm interested in the brain and human emotion. And he said, well, we have a Medical Research Council scholarship that's due tomorrow. We've never given it to anyone in psychiatry. We've never given it to a person of color before. The chances that you're getting it are close to zero. But if you get it, it will change your life. And so I actually managed to get the application in. He walked it over to the committee the following day, and I got a call a couple hours later saying, congratulations and welcome to Stellenbosch. And when I went there, I was sitting in a dorm room, and in that dorm room, I remembered my final exam in psychiatry from the year before. And my external examiner was from NYU. And I had done well in the exam, so he said to me, look, if you want to come to NYU, we'd take you tomorrow, but I think you should be at Harvard. And I didn't really register anything. But the following year, because I had created this kind of, this momentum, this motivation, this vision, I decided to give Harvard a call randomly. Now, who calls Harvard to get in? But the short story is that I eventually got in just because I made that call.
Wow. That is amazing. Yeah, that's quite the story. Well, I know that was a long time ago, but congratulations again. That's amazing. I want to ask about the reticular activating system as well. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this, but I'm just curious how that might play into this and what exactly that is when you expect to see something, because this was new to me and I recently learned about it, and I've just been amazed by a lot of the stories I've heard. But what's your opinion of expecting to see something and then seeing something that you wouldn't otherwise see?
Well, what happens when you expect to see something is that you put your brain on high alert, right? It's like if you've been thinking about a white car and you go on the street and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, every car is white, because your brain is oriented toward it. So the reticular activating system is an awareness part of the brain that can become stimulated if it is primed. So if somebody is thinking about something over and over again, they're much more likely to notice it. And then but I don't think it ends there. I think you sort of have to approach it, and you have to be curious about it, and you have to see what comes next. So a big piece of this is, I think, curiosity. And I think what a lot of people don't recognize, and this is something that I talk a lot about, is that the brain actually can do a lot of stuff with faith. So people think, faith is like you need evidence before you can believe something. Well, faith also directs the brain to collect evidence. So if you have faith that you might find a house in Rancho Santa Fe, for example, you're gonna start looking at houses in Rancho Santa Fe. But if you don't have faith that you could find that house, you'll say, your brain will say, thank you, good night, I'm going to sleep. And what a lot of people don't realize is that faith is something. Studies by Andrew Newberg, for example, have shown, Andrew Newman have shown that when people are in a state of faith, it activates the parietal lobe and dissolves the connection between self and other. So you are closer to being one with the world. And I think the law of attraction, from a brain perspective, if you can optimize the brain to become closer to being one with the rest of the world, you are much more likely to be in a state to take advantage of that law.
I want to ask a little more about this, but is the subconscious mind, how does that tie into this, because I understand that most of what we do in our day-to-day life is, I mean, through the subconscious. We don't understand. I mean, you understand probably, but how much this plays a role, because sometimes even all just without an alarm clock, just wake up at the exact second, and it's just, it seems uncanny, but it can't be a coincidence. So how does the subconscious play into this sort of thing?
When I think about people who have been very successful in my practice at getting what they wanted, it often feels like they've addressed some subconscious obstruction that was blocking them. I think about someone who came into my coaching practice, who was making a couple $100,000 a year, is continuing to make money right now in a company that's valued, over $250 million and increasing. I feel like there were real subconscious obstructions that he was not addressing, which in the course of our dialogue he did address. Most neuroscientists would probably agree that although there's no definitive percentage, at least 95% of what is going on a day-to-day basis is happening outside of conscious awareness. And the body is kind of amazing, right? If you think about it, when you get up in the morning, you're not like, okay, heart beat, lung breathe, leg move. I mean, all the stuff is happening on its own without conscious input. So there's a lot of evidence to show that what happens outside of conscious awareness can change your brain. So, for example, one of the things that I studied when I was at Harvard was looking at brain reactions to fear that is outside of conscious awareness. So we would show people fearful expressions on faces that was so fast that 10 to 30 milliseconds that the brain had no conscious awareness that they'd even seen the image. But when you look in the brain, you saw activation of the fear processing center, the amygdala, illustrating that, in fact, unconscious emotions, even emotions you don't know you can experience, can actually change the brain. And so the opposite of that would be true as well, right? If you have an emotion like awe, for example, we know that awe, looking at an amazing sunset, looking at a breathtaking dance, looking at an animal that really sort of takes your breath away, awe is a strong emotion that increases dopamine in the brain and allows for greater alignment between your mind and your body. You feel like a more congruent person. And that is why, when I teach anything around the law of attraction, I teach sort of the habit of having to expose yourself regularly to things that give you a sense of awe, because it's training your brain to be in the state of reward and being in the state where you lose the separateness of self or ego, and you connect to something much greater than yourself. It's a little bit like, sometimes people would ask me, why do I like flying into New York City? And it's like, because it's so overwhelming. And everything is so much bigger than me that you can't help but feel like you're just a tiny speck in this huge sea. Or if you look at the Grand Tetons in Jackson Hole, when you just look at the vastness of whatever's happening in front of you, you feel small relative to that. But what's also cool about that is you feel connected to it. And I think when we're talking about the law of attraction, we're optimizing brain states to feel connected to things outside of ourselves.
When we connect with things outside of ourselves, does some of that include what some people would call the quantum field, or this like a consciousness outside of ourselves? Or do you just mean an energy, or what exactly do you mean?
I think all of those things. So I'll explain them in two different ways. So one of them is that I think a lot of people don't recognize that emotions are not just reactions to the world. They're actually, emotions are broadcasts to the world. They're electromagnetic signals that carry a certain frequency and vibration. And so if you're putting out a frequency of fear, in all likelihood, that frequency will seek out something to justify itself, a thing that can frighten you. Whereas if you're putting out a frequency of faith, in all likelihood, you will meet something like that. But what we've discovered recently, which I think is one of the most exciting parts of science, is that when we look inside neurons, we see little tubules, which we used to think just supported the cells. But now we're realizing that even within the cell, there is what we call quantum communication. And what that means is we used to think the way the body worked was you go from one cell to another cell to another cell. But now we realize two phenomena can occur at a distance. In quantum physics they call that spooky action at a distance. But the idea is that they can happen, but you're not quite sure how, because it's not traveling from one to another. There's some quantum phenomenon in place that's causing that. And Roger Penrose was certainly somebody who sort of advocated for this, because they observed this quantum sort of movement in the brain. But more recently, there's a theory called integrated information theory, which suggests that consciousness is not just within the brain, but might exist all around us. And rather than consciousness being in the brain, it's possible that we exist in consciousness. So what this would suggest is that the implication would be that if you can vibrate at a certain intensity, meaning your electromagnetic signal, your emotional frequency, your sense of coherence is at a certain frequency, it is possible that there is a quantum effect elsewhere where there will be a search for a matching outcome. So when we talk about people who have known a number, or people who have actually sort of, who've been in a situation where they found a house. I mean, I've had another occasion where my first house actually flooded. And I was sort of like, I was thankful there was insurance, but I was like, oh, this is going to take a long time to fix. The very next day, I started looking at houses that I could not afford. And so everyone was like, what are you doing? Like, looking at these are like, I said, I'm just looking at a house that I like. I want to be in a good mood. They're like, well, how can you be in a good mood if you just lost your house? Now you're looking at something you can't afford. And I said, well, I don't know. I'm just going to keep looking at them because I like them. And, one thing led to another, where I ended up finding an insurance adjuster who was really helpful. I ended up connecting with the builder who really took to me, who said, I'll build you this house of your dreams if you want it. And so had I not been open to that possibility would never have existed. So what I advocate to people is that I don't feel like this is just wishful thinking. I think it's building of your neural architecture to believe, to have faith, to understand that there are quantum phenomena that occur within the human body, and that it is important to entertain the hypothesis that these quantum phenomena can connect with consciousness outside of ourselves. And if we do, we might just discover even an anecdotal event that seems to justify that. Whereas when we close that off, then we live a life of linear outcomes. And everything is, this is only happening because I did this. This is only happening because I did this. I think quantum phenomena tend to freak people out. Like they tend to think of them as like, super magical and strange phenomena. But, there have been all kinds of studies done in this realm. Dean Radin, for example, has done a bunch of studies showing how, intentional positive feelings can impact cells that are distant from that intention. Now, a lot of this is questioned in science because in science you use large sample sizes. And so usually you can't prove that this works for a large number of people. But my belief is that different people oscillate at different frequencies. And in one study, you're not going to find the same people who have the same degree of faith, openness, vibrational intensity. And so they're probably going to cancel each other out. But for me, in science, what's important is paying attention to the anecdote. Because if it works for one person, why wouldn't you want to learn from that to be able to teach another if they're open to it?
That is so fascinating. And with this consciousness outside of ourselves that we can be, or that we are connected to, is this kind of like the Matrix? I mean, it kind of sounds like the Matrix, but this is real quantum theory. So how do you compare that to the Matrix or that sort of concept?
Well, I think the way I would think about it is that for every prediction algorithm that is run by the brain, we have a choice in choosing the data that we feed it. And so if you're choosing blue pill type data, you're going to get a blue pill prediction. If you're choosing red pill type data, you're going to be getting red pill predictions. So our predictions shouldn't be, when people are doubtful about these things and they're like, no, this is not going to happen. Whatever you believe, you're probably right. Your brain is going to come up with that prediction and prove you right. Whereas I think people who are willing to continue to believe, I think are at least continuing to explore. And I always say, I don't like to be full of myself about these ideas. I don't want to convince somebody that, they have to believe me, or that I'm simply saying that I am one of those people who chooses to believe that there is a choice in the kind of consciousness you can live in. And when you live in that consciousness, it can change things. I mean, a good example of this is transcendental meditation. So if you look at long-term meditators, long-term meditators were shown in a small sample to downregulate, they turned down all 49 genes associated with inflammation, and they turned up the genes associated with immunity and oxygen carrying capacity. So you might ask, how does your consciousness state change your genes? Well, it's not the first study to show that. How you change your consciousness can change your genes. And now we're beginning to see, and this is sort of the genome and the epigenome, but the external environment we call the exposome. And we're beginning to see that we are not really disconnected from what's around us. There was a study done by Grau and colleagues where they had some people in France and some people in India. It was a small sample size as well, but they connected their brains to the internet, and they had them say words in Spanish like "hola," but they couldn't see each other and they couldn't hear each other. But what they found was that across countries, those thinking those words transmitted those words from India to France, which means that thoughts, when they access the internet, can travel long distance and influence people long distance. That's the implication of that idea. We know certainly at a short distance, we all have mirror neurons in our brains. So when I have an emotion, you will, if you are looking at me, it's going to mirror in your brain, and when you have an emotion, it's going to mirror in my brain, which means that we might think of ourselves as being very separate, but in reality, as I look at you, you are an image in my brain, and when I hear you, you are a sound in my brain, and you're actually living inside me, and I am living inside you. And that's true for everyone in the world when we're interacting with one another. So in my book, Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, I suggest that perhaps we are less like different buoys out in the ocean and more like beads on a chain of consciousness. And that consciousness is really what goes through every human being's brain. And how you decide to prepare your brain to interact with that consciousness is how I think our individual outcomes are often developed. And it's also not just about the brain, right? It's also about the rest of the body. I always half joke that I don't really believe in psychiatry because the brain doesn't stop functioning at the level of the neck. I wouldn't be able to move my right foot if it were not for my brain. And we've talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which means the adrenal gland is just above the kidney. So stress is about a connection between the brain and the kidney. It's like, yeah, more and more we're finding that actually the whole body is connected, and that the whole body is connected to the universe as well. And that, if you just consider that for a second, it really changes how you can think of your place in consciousness in the world. Because rather than being separate, you start to feel connected. And when you start to feel connected, if you were connected to another person, you would ask them questions. You would get closer to them. You would know more about them. Well, if you become connected to consciousness, you will ask more questions. You will get closer to consciousness, and you will know more about consciousness. So for me, it's a win-win no matter what. Regardless of whether you believe or refute that, it's a win-win when curiosity allows you to become more intimate with phenomena in the world.
A lot of people watching or listening to this have had experiences where, most people have experienced that they're thinking about somebody and all of a sudden someone texts or they pop up in their life all of a sudden, or you have a dream about like I dreamt about winning the lottery 3 months before it happened in real life. And it was so vivid and so real that I believed it was going to happen. But I've had many dreams like in it, other than or in addition to that. And so I know this happens to people where you were thinking about something and you believe it's going to happen or you before it happens. So is that part of like this connection to this larger source?
Yeah, I think it's pretty well. Most scientists would agree that there is this precognitive state that we can all be in. In fact, Marsbridge and colleagues have looked at this as well, and there's a phenomenon called predictive anticipatory activity, which is basically the body can respond physiologically in accordance with an event that has not yet happened, which means that there is a predictive capacity within the body as it's putting two and two together. Now, you may ask, well, how is this possible? Well, there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, the DMN, which is the unfocused brain. So in Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, that's what the book is about. How do you tap into the unfocused brain? Now, when we focus, it's important. We get tasks done. We know what to do when we go from A to B to C to D. But your focus is only as good as the depth that you went to retrieve the information. Because in the unfocused state, you activate the DMN, and the DMN is known as the crystal ball of the human brain. And it's known as the crystal ball of the human brain because it only when you stop focusing, like in dream states, when you're going on a walk on a windy path, does the DMN start activating. And when it starts activating, it starts pulling all kinds of variables and starts creating these predictive algorithms, like in your dream, where it happened to be accurate. And if you ask me, it probably was a combination of logical data plus emotions plus some kind of alignment with your body where everything comes together. And then you have the sense of congruence. And you're like, yeah, I feel like this is going to happen because that congruence is a signal. When we talk about congruence, one of the things that I often teach when I'm teaching how to optimize the brain for law of attraction is the heart has like 100 times the magnetic field than the brain. So the heart is a very important part of these equations. And they are oscillating at a frequency of zero point 0.1 hertz. You have the synchrony between the heart and the brain. And this synchrony is one of those characteristics that I think most people who say they've achieved this outcome as a result of the law of attraction, I think they will report some sense of congruence or synchrony. Like I woke up from a dream and I was like, it was so vivid. I just felt like the synchrony had announced itself. And for me, what's exciting about this is whether you believe it or not, why wouldn't you want to explore this about yourself? At least try to get to know yourself in that way.
Oh, absolutely. So how do you, I mean, this is the $1 million question. How do you, and I want to ask about this new course, this mini course that you have in it as well, and it's just a second, but how do you activate, how do you tap into this DMN? How do you get to that deeper level? How do you get your heart and everything else to congruent with each other?
Most people live their whole days with sort of focus fatigue, right? And then they're out for the count. But in reality, there's a rhythm, which is cognitive rhythm, which is focus, unfocus, because you're refueling the brain throughout the day. Now, it turns out when you unfocus strategically, you activate this DMN. And your question is, well, what are ways in which you can unfocus? Well, 5 to 15 minutes of napping can give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. So that's one mechanism. There's another mechanism called positive constructive daydreaming. Jerome Singer in the 1950s was able to show that just sitting at your desk and daydreaming is probably not helpful. But if you are doing something low key while you are imagining something positive, like running through the woods with your dog or lying on a yacht, this actually activates the DMN and also increases your creativity and re-energizes you. There's another technique that I talk about in the book, which is psychological Halloweenism. So there was a study that was done that showed if I give you a creative problem and I ask you to act like a rigid librarian, you are statistically significantly less likely to solve it than if I ask you to behave like an eccentric poet. So if I gave you the problem and I said just throw a cloak over you, walk around like a poet, that for some reason the brain feels like it has a permission to seek a creative solution because it's being a different character. Whereas if you're being another stereotype character, like a rigid librarian, you're like, no, I will not look. So it's kind of interesting that just by changing your personality, you can change your capacity for success. And then there's a technique that I teach called possibility thinking. And possibility thinking has to do with believing that something is possible, even if it is not yet in reality, because you have a sense of confidence that you can achieve it even if you've not achieved it before. I call that sense of confidence existential confidence. Frankly, I think most people have been duped into thinking they can only know if they've been educated or if they've been to school and they've learned something. But I always remind people, you know, kids don't walk around saying, I'm going to go to Ivy League school or I'm not going to walk. They figure out how to walk. They hold on to the edge of something, and everybody has a different way of learning how to walk. But every human being has an intrinsic capacity to learn how to do this. We just forget about this intrinsic capacity. So possibility thinking is about reawakening this intrinsic capacity so you can learn how to get to your goal. Another method is doodling. So Jackie Andrade and colleagues showed that people who doodle 29% have a 29% improvement in memory. Now, with every study in medicine, there's a contrary study. There's been another study showing, no, that doesn't happen. You have to be doodling something that's relevant. But certainly for a sample of people at a certain point in time, it did work. So, and then booster breaks are another way. You can take a 10 to 15 minute booster break, which just activates this unfocused brain to give you insights. And if you're wondering, well, is there really any evidence about this? Well, Einstein called his discovery a musical perception. He said he didn't come to it through some logical means. It was just some musicality. And then he figured out the logic afterwards. Carrie Banks Mullis, who found a way of making synthetic DNA, his lab mates did not like him at all. They were like, this guy's not a scientist. He doesn't know how to do anything. He was driving from Berkeley to Mendocino. He was with his girlfriend. I think he had some wine to drink. He was stopped by a cave, started scribbling on the cave face. All of a sudden went up to his cabin and was like, yeah, this is how you do it. And he changed the face of science and got the Nobel Prize. But he too has said, Sarah Blakely, who founded Spanx, she didn't go to business school to write a business plan and try to figure out what the best product development was. She was preparing for a party. And as she was doing this, so Elon Musk talks about having the best ideas in the shower. So, and I think most humans would say they've had some pretty amazing ideas in the shower. So these unfocused times are times when we can release ourselves to our greatest intelligence. And when we do, the brain will search far and wide to figure out what these variables are. I think it's just a matter of time before we understand that the brain is not just searching within itself or the rest of the body. It's just a matter of time before we see that the brain is actually communicating with substrates outside of the human body. And there's already some preliminary evidence to suggest that. Humans can change by staring at light particles, can change the nature of those particles. Very much like the double slit experiment, which was the original experiment showing that if you shine a beam of light through two slits, you see it as a wave. If you actually put an observing presence in it, it becomes a particle. So matter doesn't just exist in one state. I think people who don't believe what we're talking about believe that what you see is what you believe. Whereas I believe something that Napoleon Hill believed when he wrote his famous book, Think and Grow Rich, which is, whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it will achieve. That it all starts with the blueprint in the mind. And then to be able to exercise the brain and optimize the brain to do this, I think would be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually have been working on a course that seems extremely intriguing to me. But what actually is this?
So, I asked myself, first of all, the law of attraction is a very old law. It was in the 1800s is when people talked about it. It was popularized by The Secret. And a lot of people talk about this in a kind of woo way. So they talk about it, and I don't mind it because I can relate to that kind of language. But for a lot of people, it's very hard to have any kind of faith because they don't have enough scientific evidence to show them that faith to build the brain. And I thought we're at a point right now where we can actually talk about the neural basis of faith. We can talk about the neural basis of the prediction machinery in the brain. We can talk about the neural basis of heart brain synchrony. We can talk about how gratitude changes the brain. Gratitude actually increases anterior cingulate activation and activates another part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and creates a much greater sense of alignment. And so I thought, why don't I share this, but do it in a way that's manageable? And so I created just 5 3-minute videos per week for 8 weeks, and also created some supporting videos for essentially journaling, and also for creating exercises, and also created some written materials in case people didn't want to just listen, because I feel like by doing a practice you can optimize your brain. And there are a lot of practices that I teach in this course. There are things like thought emotion alignment, things like how do you breathe to create brain heart synchrony. There are things like cultivation of things like gratitude. How do you optimize the prediction machinery in the brain? What is strategic unfocused that we just talked about? So, I mean, there are a lot of different techniques, and the idea is, and I made it so tangible that at the end of everything, in addition to going through the 8-week course, I said, here's a 21-day challenge to get started. Do this today, and if you do this, you will have achieved this in your brain. And every week I suggest taking 2 days off and not practicing anything, just letting it all sink in, because that's how learning occurs. But essentially, what I did was I took the brain science and I said, let me make it so that it helps to enhance people's faith about the fact that the brain is capable of behaving in these funky ways. But in addition to that, let me give people a specific thing to reflect and a specific thing to do, so that by the end of this 8 weeks, they, regardless of whether they feel like they've tapped into the law of attraction or not, and I think a lot of people will feel that, I think they will at least feel like they've done things to optimize their brain. Most people would agree that refining your prediction machinery, creating emotional congruence, allowing yourself to be exposed to things beyond the linear, could actually really elevate the way in which you interact with the world. So I'm hoping that people will find that helpful and that they'll use this to their advantage to discover their higher selves. As you said, people who have already won lotteries or have had their vision boards come alive for them believe this. But I think most people, including myself, I mean, I can tell you the absolute truth is when I was recording the course, I had written the course. So I was like, now I'm just going to record the course. I was so excited about it because I forgot little things that I had written about, like, wait a minute, like instinct is a higher form of intelligence. Like, why did I forget that for you to connect to a field outside of yourself, you can't just think your way to it. The thinking is the practice. This course is like teaching a tennis player how to play the forehand, the backhand, how the slice, basically teaching each of those things. But eventually, I build the course up to the point where I say, now it's time to let go. Because when you're playing tennis, you're not going to win a match if you're thinking about every shot. You've got to trust that your body is going to take you there. And similarly, when I suddenly realized, I said, I think I've been a little bit too cognitive. I need to be more in my instinctual being so that I'm not stuck in the cognitive sphere. And so I think this course is a course that's aimed at getting people through the cognitive and emotional processes into a more instinctual version of themselves, where they're playing the sport of life with an integrated sense of self.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I can't wait to try it myself. And we will put a link to it in the description if you're watching this on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're listening to this today. And Srini is generous enough to give a small commission to this channel as an affiliate deal that goes to help support this channel as well. So thank you very much, Srini. But it just does sound extremely, extremely fascinating. But I have questions that could go on for hours. We are running kind of short on time, but I do want to ask, 'cause I have to get to this, if someone wants to bring about more luck into their life, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but more luck into their life, whether it's anything really, getting a promotion, their dream job, a relationship, even perhaps the lottery or something else, an abundance of money, what is your best advice for them?
Well, let's first take a look at what luck means, right? So, luck is the sudden occurrence of a positive event that cannot be accounted for by any kind of obvious mechanism. So, the first thing we have to remember is that luck cannot just be created by something obvious. Something non obvious has to happen for luck to occur. Now, I think in many instances, preparation for luck matters. And that's why I created this course, right? Preparing the brain to have faith, preparing the predictive machinery, preparing this heart brain synchrony, preparing the electromagnetic signals of emotion, preparing this consciousness, being open to miracles is an important dimension of how you can invite luck. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. In the scientific literature, there's a thing called the miracles of Lourdes, where in Lourdes, France, people who have had terminal illnesses, advanced cancers, really chronic diseases, go there and they pray and they get suddenly better. And nobody can figure out why. Now, they have doctors assigned to the center. And they found that there's a large, some cases have been eventually accounted for, but there are a large number of cases where there is no scientific way in which this can be described. And so what I have decided is that miracles are not an anomaly in the realm of science. They are ahead of science. And what science is doing is figuring out a way to scale these miracles in a slightly clumsy way. So when you're able to invent a chemotherapy, it's obviously amazing. A lot of people can benefit from it, but it also has a lot of side effects. But if you had an illness and you believed in this miracle, belief itself is a way to invite luck. Now, you might ask me about, well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at studies of weight loss, for example, there have been studies where people are given placebos and they're told that they are placebos. Compared to the no pill group, they lose weight. There have been studies where children who are told that they're exercising well suddenly start doing well at sport, even if they're not doing well. And that's because believing changes opioids, it changes dopamine, it changes a lot of neurochemistry. When you change your neurochemistry, you are preparing your brain for luck. Now, you might say, well, what are some of the ways this occurs? I think some are obvious and some are non-obvious. The more obvious ways are, if I am open to seeing a house that I can't afford, I'm obviously going to pursue that, and then I'm more likely to find the luck of someone who's willing to build it for me. And that is a more literal way of being open to this. But there are what you alluded to as these quantum phenomena, which are, I prepare my brain, and through a mechanism that I don't understand, something gets invited into my life. I had a friend say to me something about TM, where she said, I said, how are you getting your engagements? You're getting all these art engagements all over the world. And she said, oh, you know about TM. I'm meditating. So what I felt like she was telling me was that she was fine-tuning her neural circuitry to be able to receive what was possible in the world and to be able to get there. So if I just summarize it, I would say I think the course is a great start for, and I mean this a really sincere way. I'd love for people to just even look at this. But starting with honing in on the prediction machinery and changing your emotional congruence, engaging in gratitude practices, uh, will prepare your brain for receiving this. And then also being curious, like basically being curious about opportunity at a literal level might have you see that opportunity. Like, when I got to Harvard, for example, I called I called the Harvard undergrad campus and I said, "Hi, my name is Srini Pillay. I'm sitting in a small dorm room in South Africa thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to be at Harvard?" And the person at the other end was like, "Yes, who do you want to speak to?" And I said, "Well, the head of Harvard." And I was naive enough to ask. They said, "Well, Harvard's a big place. Head of Harvard, what?" And I said, "Well, medical school." And so they put me through the medical school office. The secretary picked up the phone and was like, "Well, actually, the medical school is a very big medical school. Like, which department?" And I said, "Psychiatry." And so Joe Coyle happened to be in his office on that day. His secretary happened to step away from a desk. He almost never answers the phone. He picked up the phone on that day. And I said, "Hi, my name is Srini Pillay. I'm sitting here in a small dorm room, wishing I could be at Harvard." And he told me later, "I thought you were crazy, but I thought, you know, I have to say the decent thing." Now, preparation is an important part of it, right? Because I had done really well. So I had the CV to go to be, but there are a lot of other people with good CVs who would never have made this call. So he said, "Well, why don't you send me your resume and a letter, and we'll see what we can do." So I sent him my resume and letter. A couple of weeks later, I get a thing saying, "Would you like to interview with the father of psychopharmacology, who's Jonathan Cole?" I interviewed on the phone. And a couple of days later, I get a FedEx that says, "Congratulations and welcome to Harvard." And I'm looking at this and I'm like, how did this happen? Like, how I just went off a hunch because somebody examined me a couple of years ago. I dared to follow whatever that messaging was implicit in that. And then I got there. And so when I got there, I did research, and everyone said to me, "You got the most glowing recommendations." Even the person, they even tried to help me because I needed to, there was an exception about how I did clinical work. So they had to have me do it, but then get supervised. They said, "You're getting the rave recommendations, but there is no way you're going to be able to get into this program. It's the number one program in the country." And I spoke to the training director and I said, "Why?" And he said, "Honestly, there's so many qualified candidates. Like, it's impossible. We have 6 spots in the first year." And so I thought, okay, well, what do I do? Well, it's been working so far. I'm just going to keep going. So I applied to a poetry contest, won that. I wrote a major paper in brain imaging, and that got published. So there were concrete things that happened. And when I went for my interview, they were like, "We had no idea this was you." And it was sort of funny because they did have an idea. But it was interesting that all their door closings meant nothing to my mind. And so I think if you're trying to invite luck into your life, I don't think you want to be a person who closes doors prematurely. I think you want to always be evaluating. I mean, there are many things in my life I have not gotten, but I think that when you have a brain that is predisposed to remembering the positive moments in your life, I think I think it really helps push you through whatever difficulty you think you're experiencing. So, in short, I think that luck is cultivated by optimizing a brain for faith, for prediction, for miracles, for emotional congruence, and for openness to quantum communication. And I think hard work can't hurt because, at the very least, it will help move that luck in a certain direction. And I think persistence is frequently helpful, even when doors are closing, because all closing doors are simply information about how to reroute yourself in your life. So I would recommend that kind of growth mindset, that you can always get to where you want to get to, even if you don't know how to get there, is how I would recommend people actually take on their lives.
Well, that is very, very inspiring. I love all of that. That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Serini, where can people find more about you. Your books. We're here with Srini Pillay. He's the author of The Science Behind the Law of Attraction, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, and a new course that we mentioned earlier, which sounds extremely intriguing. But Srini, where can people find the course and your books and more about you?
We'll be making more announcements of the course on my Instagram. My Instagram is Dr. Srini Pillay. So it's at my handle is at Dr. Srini Pillay. That's also you can also find me at Dr. Srini Pillay on Facebook, on Meta, and on LinkedIn as well. And for my website, you could find me at drsrinipillay.com or at nbgcorporate.com. Neuro Business Group is what it stands for. I also do leadership development work with corporations. I do a lot of different things, actually. I just finished writing a musical, and I've co-founded 2 tech companies. So I'm in an exciting phase in my life where I feel like the boundaries are dissolving, and the mission that I have, which is I actually believe the things we're talking about, I actually believe they are connected to health span and healthy longevity. And so I'm opening up a field which is psychogenic longevity, which is how do I use my brain to optimize my health. And I just finished writing a paper that we resubmitted, and the number one variable that I think emerged from psychology was self-transcendence. So if you are able to not lock yourself into this very restricted idea of who you are, I think it not only has positive impacts on what you can get, but health impacts as well.
Well, that sounds fascinating. You are really on the cusp of you're doing all kinds of amazing things. And as a reminder, we will link to your course and your books in the description of this video if you're watching this on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're listening to this today. Srini, I know we're running really short on time. This interview, you mentioned quite a bit about faith and belief, the power of this. And Henry Ford has an extremely famous quote, something to the effect of, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. Do you agree with that?
100%. I absolutely believe that. And I believe that we owe it to ourselves to believe.
Well, thank you. And is there anything else before we get going here that you want to say today that I don't know enough to ask, or that you just want to say today?
I think I just want to say to anyone who's listening that regardless of what you feel about the weight of evidence and the degree of evidence, give yourself a chance in life. And rather than hemming yourself in with ideas of limitations, expand in the field of possibility, because there's always something more waiting for anyone willing to explore that field.
That's beautiful. Srini Pillay, thank you very much for your time today. Such a pleasure meeting, and I really appreciate your insights. It's very inspiring and interesting, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was lovely being with you.
Thank you.
I've done really well on the scratcher tickets. Before I won the million, I'm going to tell you, there was a source of energy that was in the air. I've dreamt about winning the lottery so many times. I'd be, oh my God, the dream was so realistic. It happened more than once.
Before you won the million?
Yes.
So you scanned this on your phone?
Yes.
And then you saw this message that says, congratulations, in big, bold print.
And they take your ID and they really check who you are. And then they sit down and kind of have a little counselor, well, do you want the lump sum or do you want, the annuity? It was just an amazing feeling, powerful. You can't believe it's happening. When it really happens, you're like, oh my God, it really did happen. But yes, you have to manifest it. You dream about it. You put the energy out there in the world.
And how do they pay you for a prize like that? Is it like a check or a wire transfer?
I'm gonna show you.